This paper, African Diaspora Families and Changing Gender Relations, a focus on gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, is something that is near and dear to my heart. And I begin by saying why I'm interested in this subject. I have studied and taught about gender-based violence. I have seen women being subjected to gender-based violence and also to intimate partner violence. I've rescued women from abusive, demeaning, and dangerous traumatic situations. I've spoken out against all of the above. I have sheltered abused women in my house. Sometimes the abused woman saw me as the enemy after the contrite husband came to beg, offering expensive and lovely gifts. I've defended abused women whose husbands were highly placed, powerful, influential, and pillars of the community. I have a cousin that was killed by her husband. I know women who died in suspicious circumstances and their deaths were not investigated, even though there were signs that their spouse killed them. I know women who stay with abusive partners for all kinds of reasons. I know women who lie and cover up abuse. Some of the abuse happens to children who have nowhere to go. Some of the abuse happens to women. Some even happens to boys and men. But this is statistically said to be lower in incidence than for women. As a matter of fact, when I was growing up, there was this guy and his wife beat him up quite a bit. And most of the time that they had a fight, he would be dressed, ready to go to work, and he wore a tie. And his wife would hold him by that tie and, tighten it around his neck and say, "I'm going to kill you," and proceed to slap him up. So, some men are abused. But like I said, it is statistically lower in incidence than for women who are abused by their intimate partners or spouses. Physical abuse is more easily recognized than psychological abuse, which is sometimes trivialized or rationalized by otherwise well-intentioned people. I think some of the abuse is due to the perpetrator's untreated mental illness. Victims are documented also to experience mental illness and may also become perpetrators in the case of children who grow up in abusive families. Institutionalized religion does not always have progressive responses to abuse. Families, when committed to preserving the facade that all is well, sacrifice the health, well-being, and safety of girls and women to keep up appearances, even sometimes penalizing the victim or requiring that a victim makes the concessions that hold family together at the expense of the victim's emotional, psychological, and physical well-being. I'm really sick and tired of the patriarchal, misogynistic, ignorant structural conditions that make this the norm. I'm determined, however, to work on finding solutions. But for our solutions to work, we must build loving communities where we form coalitions that rescue, support, and rehabilitate victims. These communities must educate, change, and prosecute perpetrators, and we must also engage in public education efforts to prevent and eliminate gender-based violence and intimate partner violence in our communities. So this focuses on the African diaspora, and I'm going to say a little bit about the African diaspora. So we don't have accurate statistics, but it's said that approximately 30 million Africans are migrants both within and outside the continent. This constitutes an estimated 3% of all Africans and includes refugees, exiles, and people who migrate by choice. Paradoxically, most of the migration occurs in the smallest countries, and Cape Verde has the lead position in terms of migration. The rate of migration for Cape Verde is about 40% in 2010. Also, most of the migration by Africans occurs within the continent itself, and there are significant regional variations. So Southern Africa has about 66% of the migration, and it's intra-regional within that region. Majority of the people in the Southern African region flock to South Africa, the country, and also in West Africa, there's an estimated 70% of migrants who migrate within the region. Then North Africa is actually a huge percentage. 90% of migrants from North Africa go outside of the continent. And I think this might be because of North Africa's proximity to Europe. Approximately half of all of the African migration goes outside of the continent. Majority of the Africans who migrate go to Europe, and this is also a result of Africa having been predominantly colonized by Europe, or maybe exclusively, I should say. So people go to France, they go to the United Kingdom, they come to the United States. People also go to the Emirates. So Saudi Arabia attracts a lot of African migrants. People who migrate include refugees and traders and workers, as well as exiles. People go from less to more politically, economically, environmentally, and socially secure areas, according to the primary needs of the people concerned. So the ILO also has studied this phenomenon, and as far as the ILO is concerned, the figures I gave are actually smaller than what it sees as going on. For the ILO, about 140 million people of African descent are living outside the continent. But I think what explains this large number is that the ILO is probably counting both very old African migration that was forced, as well as the newer, more voluntary African migration, as well as the descendants of those migrants. So when we look at the historical and contemporary migration, African immigrants have now become part of transnational communities that are found virtually everywhere in the world, in all the continents, in all the regions. So this immigration and diasporization are very, very challenging experiences. So when people become immigrants, either because they want to, this is volitional, or because they are forced to become immigrants, which is as a result of compulsion. People must devise coping mechanisms that enable for them to settle where they go. And many of them really seek to be connected to their homeland. So anything that helps them to facilitate such connection, they tend to treasure, and they go to very great pains to try to nurture such connections. But on the other hand, there are people whose leaving of their homeland is a result of some traumatic experiences. Some of those people actually try to erase some of those traumatic memories. They want to forget, they want to disconnect. And when we see African immigrants and migrants and diasporas, we can see that, on the one hand, some have very deep, enduring ties to their country of origin that they nurture very carefully and deliberately, and others just want to cut out. Now, even for the old diasporas, where people were captured and enslaved, and this was a very violent break from the homeland, there remains a lot of psychic and literary, religious and customary connections that tend to be maintained, even linguistic connections. So I'm not looking at the old African diaspora. I'm looking at newer post-1945 African immigrants and refugees and asylees and exiles. And I see this community as maintaining the connections through language, creative expression, imagination, cultural linkages, remittances, folk ways, food ways, philanthropic flows, civic engagement, and a very palpable desire for return to their home countries, which is sometimes called in immigration literature the myth of return. And given the explosion of communications, cutting-edge communications technologies that are accessible to anybody that can afford them, a lot of the communication that's happening between home and diaspora has tended to be through virtual electronic means. So we see an African diaspora developing that needs actually to be studied more intensively by scholars who are interested in the subject. Then, I'm going to talk about families and changing gender relations and how this tends to complicate life and sometimes produce some of the intimate partner violence and gender-based violence that is the main subject for this paper. So due to cultural retention, we see in the old diaspora in the US, the African American diaspora, family patterns that are very much influenced by African origins. Also, it's inevitable that gender relations would change over time. But some scholars have said that immigration changes gender relations to give women more autonomy and sometimes to disrupt the gender balance within families. So when I look at the Nigerian immigrant community of which I am part, there are professional women who, like those back home, have financial autonomy. So the financial autonomy is not new in terms of how Nigerian gender relations operate. So these immigrant women, however, don't have the kind of social networks that they have back home in Nigeria. So they have to do more child care, more elder care, and they have more burdens in terms of keeping the family together than back home. So now going from the Nigerian to the general immigrant African community, many African immigrant women work, and some of them work in the informal economy because they don't have access, since they don't have sometimes official papers that enable for them to claim residency and then have jobs on the books. Many people work off the books, and this work is actually harder than the work that people do in the formal economy. Plus it has a lot of constraints to it, but I'll get to that. So these women have to take care of their families, clearly. Some of them are skilled, technical, professional workers. There's a lot of people who work as home health aides, and quite a number of people who work in the service sector, doing all kinds of jobs. Some clean hotel rooms, they do anything that they're able to find that would make an income so that they can take care of financial responsibilities. So we have many part-time workers. We have many small-scale, informal, international traders in cloth, jewelries, and accessories from Asia. So some people actually travel to China, Bangkok, and such places. They travel to places in Europe like Italy, France, and the UK. They travel to places in the Middle East like Dubai and Beirut. They travel to go buy merchandise that they then sell. So this is a significant source of income for many of these women. Most African immigrant families also struggle with life challenges and the harsh immigrant experience, but they manage to live in relative harmony and peace. In Nigeria, fathers and even mothers take less direct responsibility for housework and childcare because they can hire staff, which they cannot afford in America. So the family must cooperatively clean, cook, and manage childcare. Reluctance to change traditional gender roles causes a lot of tensions, arguments, insecurity, and anguish about lost status and income. So insecurity and anguish about lost status and income causes or escalates hostility, distrust, and rancor. Some families experience domestic violence, with anecdotal evidence suggesting that this may arise from women earning more than their husbands, causing men's insecurity and shattered egos. Some men also believe their wives, upon becoming credentialed and moneyed, have become arrogant and disrespectful. Sometimes domestic violence tragically causes deaths or mutilation of wives by husbands. Conceptually, I situate structural violence in the broad context of the deepening crisis of the African state, especially the devastating consequences of statism and neoliberalism since the late 1980s. I also observe similar structural violence in transnational migration fields, where there's lack of access to full citizenship rights and profound structural inequality, stoked by xenophobia, rising nativism, right-wing ultranationalism, and restrictive immigration regimes. I argue that the best explanation for the plight of the poor in Africa and in the world at large is the pervasiveness and depth of structural violence, which denies them of human security. And the structural violence framework that I'm using comes from Galton's work that he did in the 1960s. So there's deep and entrenched and brutal exploitation, as well as a refusal to acknowledge the existence of a problem. In this case, gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, which causes a blaming of the victim for the problem, and also a refusal to solve the problem. So although structural violence is pervasive in Africa and transnational migration fields, there are gendered and religious, class, and regional variations that cause more or less marginalization. Poor women are affected to a greater degree because they already are marginalized by the combined consequences of the prevalence of extreme poverty and the gender-based discrimination that causes bias against girls' and women's education, and towards more responsibility for housework and caregiving, as well as sometimes even early marriage. So there's a cultural normalization of abuse. And I'm not using cultural in the way that people think that, I'm blaming something on indigenous African culture. I'm talking about our culture as a world, that we as a world have normalized abuse and gender role expectations. And then people feel a need to protect their family honor. And, sometimes protecting of the family honor means marrying well. So arranged marriage systems have grown up to help people to make the right choices that suit their family the way they want to see it. This also, things could work out very well, but it kind of provides a possibility for abuse. So we also have abusive partners and women's fear of losing children and of being on their own because of the stigma that is attached to that, all making abuse thrive. Now, when you look at this kind of problems, they tend to be more intense, where you have the lowest socioeconomic indicators, because poverty makes for a different level of stress, that can cause breakdowns that society often does not even want to acknowledge or address. So when you have people in conflict zones and people in transnational fields, some of the problems that may be managed where people have some social capital may actually spiral quickly out of control. So the way I say this, we have intersecting and interlocking oppressions that tend to work against immigrants. So when women have undocumented status, they tend to suffer even more unduly, and they tend to suffer more than other immigrant women because they often have very few options. Refugees and asylees also have similar experience and also little to no ready access to resources and services that would have enabled them address their problems and might have offered them solutions. So although, quote, immigrants who are vulnerable to abuse have few rights to to seek protection and security from law enforcement or social and health services, there's a need to understand how hostility towards undocumented immigrants also affects the capacity of service providers to support them. This is according to a study by Buyan and Velagapudi, a 2013 study. So, pre-migration trauma and post-migration intimate partner violence has been associated with psychological distress among African refugee women. Yet, African immigrant survivors reported that they were silenced and stigmatized when they revealed intimate partner violence to family and community members. In addition, African immigrant survivors of this violence faced barriers when they attempted to access mental health and domestic violence services, according to a study done by West in 2018. So now I'll talk more about intimate partner violence in African immigrant communities. According to a report by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, intimate partner violence is a widespread, costly, and complex social problem nationwide, with serious health and safety implications. When intimate partner violence occurs in immigrant and refugee communities, additional challenges and complexities make it especially difficult to address, unquote. In this 2009 study, it is said that actually intimate partner violence is not more prevalent in immigrant and refugee communities, and that the leaders of the service organizations and service providers that the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation consulted, they all agree on this, that what we're seeing and saying, oh, it's more prevalent in the immigrant communities and in refugee communities is actually an across-the-board phenomenon of gender-based violence where women are suffering more in all communities. Class doesn't make a difference. Socioeconomic status doesn't make a difference. Level of professional attainment does not make a difference. The woman's financial autonomy does not make a difference. So this is now a really serious and complex problem, and we all need to pay attention to it. But I'm just now focused on the African diaspora, right? So the factors that make it especially difficult for victims in the population that I'm looking at to seek or obtain help are the following. One, the abusive partners may use the victim's immigration status against her. In effect, they threaten deportation to keep the person that they are abusing in check. Second, there may be language barriers and a lack of familiarity. I'm looking at the US, with the US and its social system. So these things might prevent a victim from seeking help. Third, a victim may also be afraid that if she reports violence to the authorities, she and or her partner will be treated with insensitivity, hostility, and or discrimination. And that fear, actually, the Robert Wood Johnson study says, may be justified, that this does indeed happen to people. Also, mainstream organizations often lack the socio-cultural understanding, and they themselves, these organizations, may have discriminatory or insensitive attitudes towards immigrants and refugees. So, in the context of a displaced community that is struggling to survive in what could be a hostile and discriminatory environment, quote, acknowledging intimate partner violence, survival of the community, unquote. That's from the Robert Wood Johnson study. So, therefore, there is strong pressure to maintain a positive image of one's own community and to remain silent about the problem of intimate partner violence. Finally, there are significant patriarchal cultural attitudes and victim blaming that occur in many immigrant communities. So, if we are saying that these are problems for immigrant communities, I want to be clear that there are problems also in every community in the United States. Okay? So then let me talk about freedom. So when I think about freedom is complicated, and it can't be understood if we don't take the spiritual, the physical, the psychological elements as interlinked in the experience of freedom. So I also like Frederick Douglass, who in his West India Emancipation speech in 1857 at Canandaigua, New York, said the following, and I'm quoting, "Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them, and this will continue till they are resisted with either words or blows or with both." So this is significant because I want to reiterate, power is never conceded. It has to be seized. One must be determined, even in the absence of support, to liberate oneself. So this is my word of encouragement to victims. But support from others encourages and strengthens and provides resources that may make liberation faster, more possible, and more enduring. And anybody that says that they're interested in helping victims of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence must be ready to do so for the long term. We must also support one another in doing this work because it's a huge and hard and often thankless task. To quote and then paraphrase Catherine Hirschfeld, who is an anthropologist that specializes in public health, quote, "Rigorous comparative, ethnographic, and archival research that explores the intersection of politics, economics, including illicit economies of political corruption, and the natural environment should be the starting point for scholars interested in social and economic determinants of phenomena. So we should have multidisciplinary studies that document and analyze and propose solutions to gender-based violence and intimate partner violence. We need to build institutions that support families and women. We should have information for people in gender-based violence and intimate partner violence crisis. Legal, psychosocial, material support is needed. So are policies that rescue people, that protect people, that prosecute perpetrators, and support victims, as well as also try to rehabilitate perpetrators so that we can break this cycle of violence. We must constantly, persistently, and for the long term, insist on effective implementation of policies, the application of laws, and the adjudication of gender-based violence and intimate partner violence cases in a way that offers restorative justice to victims and perpetrators. So now, what do I mean by restorative justice? Luckily, I don't even have to be original. There are people who have done work in this area. Restorative justice views crime as more than breaking the law. Crime, in this perspective, also causes harm to people, to relationships, and to the community. So a just response must address those harms as well as the wrongdoing. If the parties are willing, the best way to do this is to help them to meet, to discuss those harms and how to bring about resolution. Other approaches are available if they are unable or unwilling to meet. Sometimes those meetings can lead to transformational changes in people's lives. This is according to the Center for Restorative Justice and Reconciliation. The foundational principles of restorative justice, according to the center, are summarized as follows. Crime causes harm, and justice should focus on repairing that harm. The people most affected by the crime should be able to participate in its resolution. The responsibility of the government is to maintain order and of the community to build peace. So if restorative justice were a building, according to the center, it would have 4 corner posts. 1 is the inclusion of all parties. 2 is an encountering of the other side. 3 is making amends for the harm. 4 is reintegration of the parties into their community. So to review, according to the Center for Restorative Justice and Reconciliation, restorative justice is a different way of thinking about crime and our responses to crime. It focuses on repairing the harm caused by crime and reducing future harm through crime prevention, and it requires offenders to take responsibility for their actions and for the harm they have caused. It seeks redress for victims. It also seeks to have offenders recompense, and it seeks to reintegrate both the offender and the victim within the community. This requires a lot from communities, that they engage in a cooperative effort that enables for this restoration to happen. And governments also have a role to play in facilitating such restorative justice. So, gender-based violence and intimate partner violence, there is scourge because they mark people. Sometimes people are maimed. Sometimes people have lost their lives. Definitely, everybody in that situation, in the abusive situation, is marked. And the harm is especially severe for children who, if they are not rescued, restored, and given psychosocial assistance, may actually replay the violence that they have learned to live with and to adjust themselves to in their very young lives. Thank you very much.